Hey everybody, Pete Turner, executive producer and host of the Break It Down Show. We're waiting on Will to come in. Bill's in a meeting. We're in comms on the telephone, and so I thought I would just check in so you know that hey, we're all going to get together here in a few minutes. Actually, I just got a note from him right now. All right, so it shouldn't be too long. I thought I would just check in. We've talked a lot about Afghanistan here on the show, and that's over the years, not just recently when it's been super high news time, but also over the years. And so I thought maybe I would capture some thoughts here in general. Uh, Look, I'm critical of the Biden administration in part because he was the guy in charge of the Iraqi drawdown. We saw what happened with that. His right hand man, the military side, was General Austin, a guy who I briefed and saw all the time. And the disconnection between what reality was on the ground and the decision they were making was evident when we saw ISIS congeal and form. And look, it doesn't make it only Joe Biden's fault. The Benghazi thing was botched. Libya in general was botched by the Obama administration, again, at the hands of the people that are trying to run our foreign policy now. And so these folks wanted this job and they weren't prepared for it. And they don't take criticism and acceptance well. And so we get to be critical, and I promise they can take it. Are they 100% fallible? No, of course not. Joe Biden has things about him and foreign policy that are probably right. He just doesn't get it right often enough. I mean, at one point, he thought we should break Iraq into three pieces and invent Kurdistan, Sunnistan, and Shiistan. And if you understand anything about foreign policy, that's preposterous. I mean, to even suggest that is short-sighted, and so when I'm critical of that. I'm critical of his repeated failure to get things right. The more we find out about Afghanistan, the more we find out just how improbable success was given the path that we chose. Do we need to stay there? It's a hard question. You know, Politically, I can understand why we want to get out of there. Militarily, I can understand why we'd want to stay. I think there's a balance. The 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 Afghan National Security Forces need a big brother. They're not able to stand up on their own. They don't trust themselves. Once they crumble, they're all going to crumble because they're all trying to make sure that it's musical chairs, right, for these guys. And so when the Taliban is in a region and they have a firm handhold, it's going to be hard to get the ANSF in another region to say, well, we're going to fight being surrounded by three sides. It's just not tenable. You need something there to shore that up. Should that be Americans? I don't know. But when we're not there, and when the coalition isn't there, we can't forget that there's a coalition. We have partners involved, allies. And when they're there, if we diminish their role, if we put France or who are fill in the blank partnered country in a spot in the lurch, and they have to now scramble to try to get their people out. There's a lot of dual Afghan French citizens, right? If all of a sudden their citizens are being killed, we're taking out credit on our ally status with France or whoever their leadership is there, because that might cost them an election. You think about that. Like if this pullout costs 4 or 5 elections around the world, well, the next person in line isn't going to exactly want to partner with us at that same level. And there's some really big strategic problems we have to deal with. We have to find a way to work with China. There are a number of highly contested regions on the planet that involve Russia, China, and America if we choose to be involved. And so we've got to get these things right more often. On the other side, there's a lot of blame to go around on all of us. Someone like Joe Biden shouldn't be president, in Pete's opinion. Donald Trump shouldn't be president, in Pete's opinion. Hillary Clinton shouldn't be president, in Pete's opinion. There's a lot of people. Kamala Harris, not qualified to be president. There's a lot of people out there that are running for president and getting up to the front of the line. It's a reflection of us. If you don't like Donald Trump, you don't like Joe Biden, vote people out, because we're part of this problem. We've got to pick better folks to go out and run the policy part of our country. We just have to do that. So try to get involved. And look, I'm on a soapbox a little bit here, but we all hold blame in this. We wanted to go, we wanted to take names and everything else back in 2001. We're going to go out and we're going to go find these terrorists. And for a lot of times we did find them. We did blow them up, but now they're able to make them free and easy in Pakistan, train them in Afghanistan. And that is going to cause a problem for us. So today we're out. Good call, bad call, TBD, right? But as the festering pool of humanity that exists in the Pashtunistan area in particular, as that progresses and gets radicalized, and it will, because there's not enough stuff there. There's only instability there. You see how hard it is for us to be there. But as that happens, the opportunity for people to go and push that hate and that fester abroad to our partners in Europe, to the United States, to wherever, that's going to exist. And there's nuclear weapons involved now because Pakistan is a nuclear power and they're not a terribly stable place either. So we're going to have to deal with this at some point. These things are always choices. So we leave, there's a cost. If we stay, there's a cost. When we lose 13 service members and have over a dozen others injured in a blast, that is a cost of doing business as a military. If we need to have a presence in Afghanistan, we have to accept that there is going to be some death. We have to have people push forward into dangerous places to do the work that they need to do to, if nothing else, draw the fight there as opposed to in Kansas City, Kansas. So these are things that we have to address at some point as a nation. We've also got to address the part that we're just not getting along. It's not possible to change from A to B on the dial between Democrats and Republicans and our policy. It's just not sustainable to do that. We don't have enough people working in collaboration. There's entirely too much partisan. Look, I'll be critical of Joe Biden again here. Democrat needs, the party needs got in front of the actual strategic needs. It's a hard decision. It's a really hard decision. And there's a lot of values where it's going to be a terrible outcome. And it was going to be terrible no matter what. This version of terrible, though, could be avoided. And I'll say this. We put 25,000 troops in D.C. As the election was being solidified in January, February, that time frame. If we can put 25,000 people in D.C., and D.C. is not a big place, that's a division. That's multiple brigades together trying to ensure safety and stability. Then we can surely put 25,000 people at Bagram Airfield and Kandahar and at Kabul and work on withdrawing in a sane way, not just pick a date and stick to it and then have our Secretary of Defense say, I don't know where all the Americans are. I don't know that I can protect them. That is not a healthy country. That is not a healthy administration. So those are some thoughts on that. We could talk specifically, and we have, and we will continue about other aspects of Afghanistan because there's plenty of blame to go around. We screwed this up. I screwed this up. I did my best to try to figure out how to do this better, and I didn't figure it out fast enough. I didn't figure it out in a way that it was sustainable. You know, I'll take credit for that. I worked as hard as I knew how, but there weren't enough people like me pulling on the rope. And so really, when I had the ability to go higher and speak higher, I would rather stay in the field. And that probably cost me some influence, definitely cost me some influence. And maybe if I'd gotten higher, I could have done a better job advising at a higher level. That's on me. I didn't get a chance to do that. I didn't see that as being important. I didn't see it as a fight that I wanted to take on. And that was probably an error in judgment. But it gets worse. There's just basically any initiative we tried, whether it's agriculture, which you guys have heard me talk about quite a bit on this show, agriculture, civil affairs, psyops, all failures, all of them. Our intelligence assets. I'm going to tell you a little story. This is 100% true, right? This is 100% true. So I worked in a place called Zabul. It's like a state-sized element. And Afghanistan is the size of, say, Texas. And so let's say 1/5 of it is Zabul. So it's a pretty big place. And it is loaded full of Taliban. And I mean, the Taliban come from that area. This is the heartland of the Taliban. And so we have to win here, right? Like you have to win. We have the ability to take it to these people, find them and destroy them militarily, and also build up economically, politically, socially. These are all aspects of the modern fight. Okay. There is this mythic figure in the Taliban world. His name is Mullah Omar. He lost an eye in combat. This is a tough warrior, right? This guy is a religious leader and a warrior. You look at the religious side of who this guy was and what it meant to be him. And he does, and I'm not exaggerating, he does some Raiders of the Lost Ark level archaeological stuff where he puts on the robe of the Prophet Muhammad. And that's only possible if you're the anointed one, if you're fulfilling this destiny, this prophecy, right? Think about this. And I'm not explaining this to imagine on the Christian side, if somebody went out and grabbed Jesus's cloak from a cave and put it on, and if the Christian folks are like, oh my God, this guy's the chosen one. How else could he get this? It's God's will. That's kind of the level. And I'm still probably not explaining this powerfully enough because there's a fatalism. Islam is about, and this is not derogatory towards Islam. Christianity is focused on faith. Islam is focused on surrender. And so if someone puts on this cloak, if someone has this touch from time, from Muhammad right to Mullah Omar, you've got a powerful leader. You got a powerful guy that can say things, and it's like, this is the word of God coming out of this guy's mouth. You'd want to, I don't know, in theory, try to find this guy, right? I mean, we found Osama bin Laden. The other guy on that list would be Mullah Omar. And where is he? Where's Mullah Omar? He only got one eye. We always heard, but he's only got one eye. That's the thing we talked about all the time. No shit. That dude was 3 miles from where I lived. There were 3 camps clustered right there. Fob Smart, Fob Wolverine, and Fob Loggeman. And that's where Rich and I lived. There's thousands and thousands of soldiers patrolling in every direction on any street they wanted. This dude lived right down the road. By down the road, I mean, I don't know exactly how close. I've never seen the actual house or anything, but this dude just kicked it at his house, just hung out, and we never could find him. What kind of military is that? What kind of military success is that? We wanted to go push the Taliban south, go down to the border, ensnare the Taliban and push them south to Pakistan. Well, guess what? Just stay in Kalat City and just knock on doors until you find Mullah Omar. Do a coordinate search, whatever it is, right? I don't know what the answer is, but the illustration is there. We had this guy who's this icon who is now this mythic figure because he passed on in 2015 from tuberculosis. And so we didn't get him. We didn't reliably kill the Taliban in our region. So we had this military force that just flushed in from the mountains and took over all of Afghanistan in a matter of hours. And you're telling me that all these people in these madrasas that are being radicalized and taught Sharia law and taught to oh my God, I mean, it's horrible. Taught to jihad and using the violent aspects of Islam. I am not saying Islam is a religion of violence and hate. I'm saying that people use Islam for violence and hate. And it's for sure in the book. It's like in the Bible. You can find violence in the Bible. So you have this mythic figure. You have this impossible defeat over this giant enemy, the great Satan. And they won. They're emboldened. So you look at the energy that's been expended on trying to get out, on trying to change things around, on the problems between Pakistan and by the way, Pakistan and Afghanistan don't get along except for when they get along. And when they get along, they apparently can beat the United States at war. So all of this stuff congeals into this mess where, okay, we think the war is over. We left. We're not going to be in the middle of a civil war. Well, it wasn't a civil war. It's an Islamic war. And we don't understand the Islamic aspect here in this country because we think of a separation of church and state. And that was never the case in Afghanistan. Religion is the state. And now it's even more so. Now it's a radicalized form of it. It's a very fundamentalist form of it. There are evil people that want to spread evil and have no doubt there is an actual push to create a caliphate. I mean, this is what ISIS was about. This is what, there's a lot of people in Islam that aren't into this, right? Let's push them aside. And there's probably a billion of them. But there's a lot of people that want a caliphate and want to spread Islam by dogma, by doctrine out to the rest of the world. And so we've just enabled the ability for them to do that. We've talked about the equipment, all that stuff, and that sort of works. I mean, look, Afghanistan isn't going to be able to fund its own operations. You can't be a tax collector. This is not a long-term job. Tax collector in Afghanistan, not a long-term job. It's a good way to get your head cut off. That's a good way to disappear and never come back. Because for every Taliban, there's a farmer that's like, Taliban don't come around. We don't play that around here. And they'll kill them. And the Taliban oblige by not going there. They're not all powerful, right? But they're better at that stuff than we are. So when I talk about the challenges, we're going to talk about this with Eric Kleinsmith soon too, about this fight not being over. There's a lot of people that are destabilized now. We got a bill to pay with all of our allies as we left them in the lurch. And we're going to have an Islamic bill to pay. And maybe it's not paid directly by us. Maybe it's paid through violence in Italy. Maybe it's paid, and it will be paid for sure, in violence towards Christians, because these folks will target Christians specifically, and they'll do things worse than burn down Notre Dame. Anyhow, that was my my little rant about Afghanistan, and I hope you guys appreciate it. But more importantly, my man is here, Wil Reilly. I got a chance to hang out with Wil recently in Kentucky. We had big plans to record stuff, but we're both busy dudes. And by the time I got to Kentucky, I'm like, can we just hang out and have some bourbon? And so we did. We had a good time. It's always great to have you on the show, Wil. Thanks for being here. Will you say this is Wil Reilly and you're watching the Break It Down show for me?
Yeah, of course. This is Wil Reilly and you're watching the Break It Down show.
I know we're going to talk about your recent paper, but I wanted to get your thoughts as a political scientist on the decision we made to pull out of a place that we know it radicalizes Islam and exports terror the moment it gets a chance to, because people who cut people's tongues out and hang them out of helicopters, they're not exactly the kinder, gentler Taliban that we were told to expect. These are people that hit hard with pipes, and they don't necessarily take hostages. They just kill people. They're just going to kill you. If they take a hostage, they're just going to take you long enough to kill you and cut your head off on TV to politicize your death. But what are your thoughts? Do you have thoughts on this? I know this isn't your strong field, but you're a political scientist, so you have something.
Yeah, I mean, so I think that the Afghanistan situation's a total disaster. I mean, you're now seeing some attempts to cover this up, like this is the largest number of people ever evacuated from a military defeat and so on. But that presumes like a starting point that's not good, where you lose a war and you have to take 120,000 people out of country. I mean, so what do I think about this? I mean, I think first of all, I probably would have left the U.S. troops in Afghanistan. I mean, I'm conservative, but in that sort of center-right guy with a gun and a jacket sort of sense. Like, I don't want to pull back only to the homeland and live on a farm. So when people say things like, why are we fighting these endless, brutal wars in these savage countries and all this stuff? I mean, realistically, we have U.S. troops based around the world because we're the current hegemonic power, just like China intervenes in North Korean affairs and Far East affairs. I mean, we have tens of thousands of troops in Germany, Japan, South Korea. There are a lot of army guys that spend half their entire hitch in South Korea or Germany. So it's kind of silly to say we have soldiers overseas. So there's a state of bloody war going on. I mean, of that 2,500 fairly elite troops we had in Afghanistan, I think in the past year we've taken one military casualty. It was either 1 or 0. So, I mean, while we were helping the Afghans fight their civil war, and by the way, their entire ground pounder force was dependent on U.S. air support. That's why a major reason they collapsed so rapidly, a top 2 or 3 reason. But I mean, we were taking very little loss in exchange for doing that. Like, had Joe Biden just rejected Trump's agreement with the Taliban, because you don't have to keep an opposite party president's agreement with the Taliban. Like, what kind of crap? Think about that sentence. Had Joe Biden just done that, I mean, the Taliban would have responded. We would have lost 5 or 6 guys, but that's it. And I'm not minimizing those losses, but we lost 13 to 18 people as it is, you know? So I wouldn't have left in the first place. Had I left, I mean, Melissa Chin, Miss Mel Chin on Twitter, a member of a group that I'm active with, you know, she actually started joking around like, I've got some deep Eastern wisdom, like just before you evacuate, and start a major airlift, like give your airport to the enemy. And then at the bottom of the meme, like Sun Tzu, as a joke about how silly this was. Like if I had decided to leave, and I think you might say the same, I think most competent military or business leaders would say this. First, you would set up an absolute hard line and you would tell people effectively when that began for getting all of your citizens and all your allies out. And this would happen during the period when you still controlled ground, maybe a month using Bagram. Now, I don't know all the details, but I'm just saying this seems like a fairly simple thing to do in the sense that anything at that level is simple. Second stage, you either destroy your materiel or you fly it home or you give it to your side of the conflict. You don't leave it in a base with no soldiers in the path of the other army. I mean, do you? So anyway, that's the second step. You destroy that stuff, you fly it home. One thing we lost was 23 fixed-wing aircraft. And about this, there's just no excuse. Like C-130s and shit like this. You could have just put an American or Afghan pilot in this plane, and you could have flown that plane to Israel or Turkey. I mean, like, there's no reason you would leave a fixed-wing plane in the path of your opponents ever. So anyway, that would be step 2. And step 3, I mean, the military would withdraw last. I don't know the technical terms here, but I mean, you'd have a defensive perimeter around the airbase and the airport, and the soldiers would be the last. Soldiers and guns would be the last people on the planes, and they would be out of country. What we did instead was we took almost all of our guys out, as I understand. The Taliban then took over the entire country, partly because we left that equipment right in their path, in many cases. In some cases, our allies surrendered it. But then we were forced to almost reconquer the airport, to go in and negotiate with the Taliban and to post 5,000 guys, which is twice as many soldiers as we had with heavier equipment around that airport's perimeter to get people out. And the flip side of this is because we didn't do a standard monitored 20 to 30 day evacuation, I don't know who we got out, and neither does anybody else. This is another one of these elephants in the room where people are saying, well, Biden's argument is we did a good job because we had maybe 150 to 160,000 close Afghan allies like translators. And he says we got out 120,000 people. I mean, and the implication there is we got out all the Americans and most of the allies. The problem with that is that we know that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of Americans left in country, and that there are like formed units of our allies that have tried to get to the airport in Kabul, or that have considered getting there from other areas like Panjshir, that have just been abandoned.
Yeah.
I mean, in Panjshir, they seem to just be starting a resistance. I mean, there are enough people that is happening. So the question is, who did we let onto the planes? And I'm not trying to be glib at all about our abandonment of, the people who probably become the Tigers of Panjshir, or our translators, any of that. But like, we just let on 120,000 Kabulis, probably. Like, that would be my guess, that as people who felt vulnerable in the capital city, which has an income comparable to a lot of Mexico, it's not like the rest of Afghanistan. I mean, I would assume those people simply rushed the gates, that every time an American got in, 12 Afghan dudes would break in. Like, that's what I would do in that situation. So we were left with a last-minute evacuation of a group of people that could include hostiles, and that certainly includes a lot of unknowns. Like, we don't know who those people are if our allies are still broadcasting and now calling themselves the Afghan resistance. Like, by definition, we don't know who we actually brought back.
I would say this too, like, when we get our people back, I'm going to put you on mute because I got an echo here. When we get our people back, it's one thing to say, hey, we got our people back, but not everybody. And some of them are dual citizens. And then to put it on them and say, well, they didn't want to leave. You don't, as president, get to say that. You get to say, I left Americans behind. I'm not sure if they wanted to stay or not. I believe they wanted to stay, but you don't know. And the Afghans, you cannot reliably identify an Afghan person. The Taliban can, because they just kill them. They're just like, we don't believe you, we're going to kill you. But yeah, we definitely left Afghans behind. We could have started much earlier the visa process, opened the gate on the visa process. This is something a lot of us were saying right now, like, why are we waiting until the last, the ends, the last throes of this thing? This should have been going on much, much sooner. I mean, this should have been going on during the Obama administration. Set up a program. You work this long as an interpreter. Let's get you the hell out of here. You've earned it. Let's go. But we don't take that seriously. We're a crap partner. We abandon things and people all the time. And that's just not sustainable to do that to people. I would say this, and this is important to know. A lot of the equipment that was left behind was either considered, basically not military competent anymore. It wasn't worth the money to haul it out. I mean, other than for scrap. And then also a lot of the equipment was left behind is actually Afghan National Security Forces equipment. And they've got and we had a great show with Xander Bullock. He worked on the logistics side of these. He's like, you have to realize every piece of equipment that comes with a serious service contract, and to maintain these things, to put the right kind of fuel in, there's not simple work. C-130s are broken all the time. I mean, they break constantly and they have to constantly be repaired. So for right now, they're working, but most likely most of these planes, it's not because Afghans are incompetent mechanics. It's just, it takes a lot of professional work to maintain these things. But if you're going to leave this stuff behind, control that narrative if you're in the administration, and get that word out. Like, hey, this is Afghan National Forces gear. It's captured by the Taliban from the Afghan forces, not us. We've signed this over to these guys as part of what we do. Anyhow, it did not go well. And you and I both would have made different decisions. And I find it ironical. I like to say ironical. I find it ironical that we can deploy a division, 25,000 service members, to DC post-election, but we can't, and we can move 125 million zillion people out of Afghanistan, but we can't temporarily deploy a retreating protection force of 25,000 people to ensure that we do a good job. And if you want to know you have a competent president at the helm who actually cares about getting Americans out, then they act like it. And he didn't act like it. He acted like he had a political agenda. He acted like he had ignored good advice, and he acted like, according to his phone calls, he knew this wasn't going well, wasn't going to go well. It doesn't take a lot to know. And the final thing about the Afghan forces, they're sort of our, the little fish that hangs out with sharks. As long as that shark is healthy, that little fish can hang out and live and maybe become something else. That's the Afghan forces. They need our support, whether it's through direct air support, combat advisors, whatever it is. They have to have that, because there's just no trust across the next mountain there. It's just none. And so when we think, well, these guys are getting in fights all the time, they're always fighting. Yeah, because we're there. The moment we leave, they're going to be like, jigs up, we're changing sides. Hey, welcome back, Taliban. It was always going to be that way.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot there. So one of the things that people constantly say on kind of that heterodox right is, well, why is the USA in the business of nation building? And the answer is that because when the Pax America started, there were a lot fewer real countries. I mean, you've got to remember, even Italy was, a collection of quarreling like dukedoms and so on as recently as 1890 or so. The what are powerhouse African states today? Like, no one would deny Nigeria, South Africa, Kenya are real countries, whatever their tribal disputes. Those were British protectorates where, I mean, in the highlands, you still had Maasai warriors and leather kilt hunting lions with spears. I mean, so at the start of the modern era, many states across all regions, racial groups were pretty primitive. And we decided, when you look at the Marshall Plan for Eastern or sort of Southeastern Europe, so on, we decided we're going to take some of these places like rural Greece and we're going to try to move them forward with us because that's going to stabilize the world in which we live. And I mean, in reality, a great number of countries wouldn't exist if it weren't for the presence of at least a skeleton force of good American troops. So, I mean, like West Germany after World War II, if the Americans hadn't decided to stay there after beating the Nazis, would have fallen into the communist sphere of influence incredibly quickly. I mean, when you think about Berlin, like Berlin was divided between East and West, people tend to think Berlin is kind of in the middle of Germany and the country was split down the middle and we each got half the city. No, like Berlin was hundreds of miles into the Ruski-controlled territory. We kept our half of the city free, which included their banking and financial sector, wall right down the middle of it. When necessary, we orchestrated the Berlin airlift and fed the population of the city to keep the city from falling to the Russians. The same thing in South Korea. I mean, when did South Korea become a functional democratic state? With the Wu, I believe, semi-dynastic leadership out of 1992. If it weren't for the presence of that U.S. military there and the attached U.S. civilian apparatus, that wouldn't have happened probably at all. So the same thing with Afghanistan. I mean, when people criticize the Afghan army, I think there are a lot of different levels to this, but at the most basic, little fish can grow. Like, had we stayed in Afghanistan for 50 years with just this bare bones 2,000 to 5,000 guys, you would see a very different country at the end of that period. Would I encourage that? Yeah. I might think twice about it, given how we mistreat poor white and urban black and so on communities here. But the simple fact is, all those people have literally 10 to 15 times as much money as some Pashtun tribesmen. Like, it wasn't Afghanistan that was the big drawdown on the defense budget. So, I mean, what exists at a given time can change. And U.S. nation building actually has a pretty solid history, I would say. The final thing about the Afghan army, a lot of people that are presenting the Afghan fighters as a bunch of cowards or idiots don't understand tribal dynamics. I mean, my understanding of so there are two parts to this. My understanding of what happened in Afghanistan first is that the Afghan army was specifically designed to be the ground arm that fought along with U.S. air power. So they would go in, they would encounter enemy, and the U.S. would come in and bomb. And the two sides together worked pretty effectively. If you take away half that military, if you don't transfer those specific planes to the Afghans, if the Afghan pilots get out in the first couple of days, it's bizarre to say, well, the Afghan army didn't fight very well. The main thing that they do wasn't possible. Also, it's not like the Afghan army fled in panic. Like, if you look at what happened with, the Ghani? The president of Afghanistan, who's a hipster college professor, literally, like his daughter lives in Brooklyn and is really active on Instagram. The president of Afghanistan, Didi Maud with the money, like day 2 of the fight against the Taliban. He's in the UAE right now, I think, with something like $67 million worth of gold bars and shit. So the troops weren't getting paid or knew that this last paycheck would be their last one. And I mean, my assumption would be that a lot of them, if you look at people that are from the Northern Alliance country or from Panjshir, they just took their weapons and went back to their villages. They probably took some of our stuff too. Like, they're going to negotiate with the Taliban from that position of strength behind their tribal chief. It's not like they're running away, gun dropped in the dirt behind them. They just didn't see a reason to fight for our national model for no money with the president gone. So it's not an unreasonable decision. You have to understand the mores and conditions in the place where you're fighting or the place where you're doing diplomacy. You can't pretend that every place is a white-collar suburb in Florida if you want to do something successful on the international stage. And Americans have that weakness.
Yeah, we do. let's transition, and I guess maybe we can use these Afghan refugees as a ways to get into ethnicity and race, because you've written your most recent piece. I'll put the link up here on the show, but we're talking about race, and we often lose sight of ethnicity, and we know Thomas Sowell's written about this a whole bunch. I'm sure you've studied it. It takes us a minute. By a minute, I mean, and just to counterpoint this thing too a little bit. We're not willing to stay in Afghanistan as long as it takes for us to normalize relations between this giant body of Afghans that are about to come to America, right? We know it takes more than one generation to really normalize this and get past all of the things. We have political discussions on, like the right are going to hate Afghans. And listen, if they're in your neighborhood and you see them, they're causing problems. It's just a human value to go, who's that? What are they doing? Why are they walking around? That kid doesn't have a job. I don't like that. I mean, this is the reality. And then the NIMBYism that we're going to have to deal with as well with these things. So let's talk a little bit about inculcating and repatriating these Afghan citizens.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I think that the distinction between ethnicity and race is an important one that's universally understood in political science, but that Americans don't engage with very much on a day-to-day basis. Because our ethnicities, now that Irishmen and Italians and so on have assimilated and basically become white, tend to break down along racial lines. So Koreans and Japanese Americans and so on are Asian. Black people are obviously of ADOS, African descent, so on down the line. There's some ambiguous groups like Jewish Americans. But in most of the world, race isn't a defining factor at all. This is actually something I said during my debate with Jared Taylor years ago. If you look at the most violent countries in the world, including Afghanistan, but at the time, Bosnia or the former Yugoslavia, Congo, so on down the line, they're almost all mono-racial. They're poor states where everyone in Afghanistan is a West Asian Caucasian, except for some Hazara. But everyone's one race, but they're divided into tribes composed of same race members that fight constantly. So like racial diversity doesn't make states any more violent than they were before. This is actually a really important point rarely for me, but from the left. People fight other people that are about one standard deviation away from them in terms of difference. Basically, that can be anything from the village over the hill, which is why mountainous regions are so violent, to a different skin color, to a different ethnic group. But in general, in societies that don't have different skin colors that consolidate into races or kind of regional blocks, people fight just as intensely based on ethnicity. There's nothing to bring about that type of consolidation. So the Afghan violence, you're right, it's ethnic, not racial. And yes, it would be a potential problem for Afghan immigrants to the USA. But the whole Afghan thing kind of reveals the complexity of these debates, because when people say there's racism that's causing this discrimination against Afghan refugees, Afghans are all white. I mean, the entire country, like I just said, is pretty much Caucasian, although West Asian Caucasian at 23andMe terms. But I mean, like Pashtun tribesmen often have like sandy brown hair and green eyes. Like they're Caucasian people. There's just a tendency in the USA to see people from failing Caucasian states, Colombia comes to mind, or people that haven't yet assimilated to mainstream middle-class culture as kind of non-white. In reality, I mean, most immigrants from the Islamic world are Caucasian. Conflicts between Anglos and Arabs or something like that can't be attributed to racism. That's all ethnic stuff, and Afghans know that as well as anyone. And yeah, I mean, I don't know if either of us has a precise point there, but you would certainly see that wherever the 120,000 unvetted Afghan refugees are sent. I don't frankly see this being a very big deal because it is a pretty small number of people. But yeah, are those people going to be seen as white in America or as Americans? It'll take a while. And there's definitely going to be some culture clash at first. I mean, Afghanistan is at about an 8th century level of development in a lot of the rural highlands. I mean, there are still sex with young boys that you're training to fight is still accepted in some tribes, not all. So you're going to have to get through that pretty quickly to live in Dearborn.
Yeah. And then just to take this point to the African or black side, if we had brought in 10,000 Tanzanians in a large refugee push, not that Tanzania wants to give us their people, but there would be, I mean, that's maybe the most, if not one of the very most top 3, top 5 most ethnically diverse countries in the world. They would show up here and they would be African Americans. And that's it. We would rip away all of their ethnicity, all of their culture. and not think twice about it, not even realizing what we had done, because we're very simple when it comes to race and ethnicity. We just think you're black, white, or other. Really, I mean, people of color is just other, because you just can't lump everybody into that category and act like they're all the same.
Yeah, I mean, so there are two things that come up with race and with ethnicity. Like, on the one hand, these things are real. Something that I say that's pretty controversial in modern social science is that race as a category, or something you could practically call race, obviously exists. I mean, if you put 100 Norwegians, 100 West Africans, and 100 Japanese in a sauna, naked or wearing just a cloth around their waist, I think anyone making virtually no mistakes could sort them into three groups based on real objective characteristics like kinkiness of hair, color of skin, color of eyes, size of body, leg length. I'm not going to get, my calipers out here, but it wouldn't be very difficult to do. And when you actually look at the genomics testing sites like 23andMe, I mean, what they almost universally say is that there are about 70 human regional populations, like Scotsmen and Irishmen seem to be a bit genetically different, that break down into 6 or 7 large categories with names like West African Bantu, WAB, W-A-B. And most blacks in America and in the Western world are 90+% West African Bantu. So you can identify a Nigerian guy or a Ghanaian guy and say that guy looks like an American black guy. And to the extent there are characteristics associated with race, like there's a slight edge in sprinting speed for West Africans, you would assume the Ghanaian guy and the Jamaican guy are going to have, the same chance at that advantage. Whites apparently have slightly better eyesight, so on down the line. Probably seeing across the snow and drifts in the Great North 10,000 years ago, if you believe in any sort of evolutionary theory. But that's the one hand. Okay, so there are these categories like West African Bantu that you can place humans in. The flip side, though, and the leftists, as always, have managed to confuse a valid point with a great deal of political bullshit. But the flip side of that is that our ethnic categories don't really match the real racial categories. They're just kind of made up. So Afghans are obviously Caucasian, if you want to rank them in racial terms. They would be seen as kind of something else, though. Like MENA is the term we have on the census, Middle Eastern and North African. And empirically, there's no difference, I would guess, between a Levantine North African and someone from Spain or Italy or something like that. So many of the distinctions we use in day-to-day life are totally artificial. So saying that a Levantine guy is different from an Italian guy, that's an utterly artificial distinction. And then saying that both of those guys are in the same category, which we call whites, not merely Caucasian, but they're recognized as white people in this particular country. Same category as a Scotsman. I mean, we just made that up. The reality is that in Europe and the Middle East for many years, Scotsmen and Englishmen didn't get along. There were bloody wars, Robert the Bruce and so on. So the categories we have now that we've chosen to put people in that aren't strictly genetic are largely arbitrary, and they change over time. And like one last kind of related point, we've just seen a bunch of panicking about the fact that the census, panicking on the right, like joy on the left, but that the census showed that there was a decline in the white population for the first time. But when I actually looked at that data, it just seemed like complete BS. Like what happened was that the percentage of people that identified themselves solely as white went down from like 61 to 58%. But another 18% of people defined themselves as Hispanics, and 70 to 75% of the Hispanics, I believe, were Caucasian. Like they picked one race and it was Caucasian, which is, again, somewhat different from white. Another 33 million people were biracial, often with a white dad. So, I mean, I don't view myself as white, but this was like an Asian/Irish guy. This wasn't a recent immigrant from someplace, quote unquote, exotic. A very large number of people now identify as Native American and so on down the line. Like the actual percentage of people that were more than half Caucasian and somewhere between us and skin color was probably 70 or 80% of the country. So to some extent, we're just making up all these new categories and definitions and using them as ways to separate people, which I personally find idiotic. But I don't see that this is going to have much effect on the actual demographics of the country, certainly not in the Midwest, the South, so on. But Afghan refugees are now another ingredient in that melting pot.
When we look at your new paper, and it's called basically Testing the Test for Racism, and it's available on nas.org. If you just type in Testing the Test, you'll find it. The link is sort of on there, but you are doing what a social scientist is supposed to do at the PhD level. You're either challenging, confirming, or creating new knowledge about the topic. And so you're taking these tests that we often create that kind of validate or invalidate the racial position, and you're going through and saying, I put all these tests together and here's what we're seeing. Talk a little bit about the paper and what it means and what we've learned.
Yeah, so the paper, it was actually to some extent inspired by one of our conversations where we were talking about some of these tests that are out there in sociology, and you said something along the lines of, so when it comes to applying for jobs, they're comparing a guy named like Chase Dawson with a guy named Jamarian. Like, is that supposed to show racism, or is there, a class element to that? Is there, a training element to that? And I thought the answer was pretty clearly B. So basically, I looked at a bunch of these audit studies. I did sort of a semi-meta-analysis, and then I gave some kind of tips for scholars in the field. But audit studies, for those that don't know, are these experiments where a researcher will send, say, 1,000 resumes into different potential employers. And half the resumes will be identified as, coming from Black people, and half of them will be identified as coming from white people, or Christians and Jews, whatever the breakdown is. And generally, the result is that you find a small but real level of racism, effective racism against the minority group. So, for example, there's a study called something like, are Dashika and Laquan less employable than Emily? I think I got the names a little bit off there. But the researcher there found that when you sent in applications for sort of these lower end, mostly customer service jobs, people were 1/3 less likely to call back a Black applicant than a white applicant, with the Black applicant being indicated by the name Dashika. And what I said in the piece, there are a couple major points. So like the first one is you need to adjust for class when you do this. So if you're going to bring in Dashika, you need to have her competing against like Billy Bob or like Chevy Backseat or like Bubba. And I'm not trying to make fun of either side's names, but you can't have Dashika versus Chad, because one name signals like I'm from a working class area of a big city and the other one doesn't. That's just extraordinarily obvious. So I make this point, and I say that I'd be interested in doing a study looking at just the effect of poor white names. Like if you actually send in a bunch of resumes with names like Bobby Lee, people named after places where they might have been conceived, people named after automobiles, like would those guys do any better than the Black kids with sort of the faux African names? Because they're very stereotypical naming practices for both Black and white people in the hood that everyone kind of jokes about, but I've never seen the white version used in these studies. So I make that point. Then I also note that all of these audit studies seem to take place in the same kind of arena of business, which is like lower middle class entry level jobs you can find on the internet. So like Craigslist has been used as a portal. Want ads in the Chicago papers have been used as a portal. Now it's popular, at least when you're recruiting subjects, to use the giant link up database Mechanical Turk. And I don't disagree, actually, that there might be some residual racial bias in kind of the entry-level private sector with white-led employers. So the next suggestion was, why not go beyond that? Like we know affirmative action exists in college and the Fortune 500. Why not go into that sector and take twice as much time with your study and see what response, a CV sent into 100 top colleges gets if it's presented as a Black guy's as versus a white guy's? And there you'd see the exact reverse, of course. The Black guy would have a 28% or whatever it is, school by school advantage going to these schools, getting hired for these Fortune 500s. Why doesn't anyone ever do that? Well, suspicions remain. And this is just a scientific paper. I kept on with these ideas, so we went through that, and I said another research idea that I'd like to do myself if no one takes me up on the challenge of this article is doing an audit study of Black companies. So right today, 38% of all businesses in the USA are owned by minorities or women. And nobody seems to have ever tried to isolate out those businesses, going through the Black business directory of these very successful companies like Johnson Publications and applying there and seeing what the reaction would be to a white applicant. can be right now, having interacted a lot with the black business sector, the reaction would be that people would be, again, 20 or whatever, 30% less likely to hire this guy. You'd see the exact same thing from rich minorities that you do from rich whites. And I personally, I think that the American political left would just automatically excuse that. Like, well, the black businessmen are just attempting to defend themselves against the pervasive systemic racism that they find everywhere around them, and that's why they didn't hire little Billy Bob. But nonetheless, the project's worth doing. And I just go on with a few more suggestions. Why not try this with other groups of people beyond blacks and whites? Like, a lot of resumes now will ask for one stock photo. Why not do a situation where some of the people are fat and some of them aren't? Like, I guarantee you that if you send in a bunch of models versus a bunch of Yale University looking academic women, the models for anything short of just the most wonky jobs would be the ones hired. You know, you're talking marketing, you're talking advertising. So it struck me that this whole genre was kind of being used to make these, valid but dated points about racism. And they were making them by avoiding probably 2/3 of the jobs out there, by only looking at this one characteristic. So I gave the scholars out there a little bit of advice. Hopefully they take it.
There's a similar thing that I've noticed when we talk about softball versus baseball. We want to talk about how hard it is, and we can make clowns out of professional major league players if they face Jenny Finch, who's maybe the greatest softball pitcher of all time, in the time of these kind of things. But whenever we see this, we see the super elite softball pitcher facing these baseball players, a release point that's totally different, from a distance that's totally, everything, it's a completely different game at this level, right? But you never see, Josh Hader facing some 105-pound college girl, because Josh Hader is at the very peak of his profession, and the college girl might be the best college hitter in the NCAA, but she wouldn't even be in single A ball, right? But we have this belief that somehow softball is harder than baseball, and maybe it is, but we never do that opposite study to go, here, sweetie pie, hit this 105-mile-an-hour fastball, and it's just like, we don't ever do that. And so I think you're right about this race thing. If you're going to take this racial premise, let's really take it to the next level. I wanted to ask you another confounding factor about these studies. We had a guy on the show, Robert Coombs, a couple of years back. He built a job finding robot that completed applications and created cover letters to look for jobs. And we're talking like high-end corporate jobs. This guy's a high-end player. And he realized that he wasn't going to get hired through applying to things online at all anyhow. And so he started building a robot that could find a job reliably and couldn't manage to do it. And what he determined is that most cover letters and most resumes were not being read or processed by anybody, let alone a machine. Like, they just weren't even being opened, the files, a lot of times, because they must reach a point where they're just nothing beyond this point gets read. And that would, I think, also feed into this. I know on the veteran side, it feeds into our despair. No one's listening. No one's responding. No one's doing anything. So it has to be that someone who presumes racism is the limiting factor in their getting a job. How do you test for that if you have this electronic system where it's inundated with resumes and it can't possibly be processed, all of them? You still have this racial position you have to deal with.
Well, that's actually interesting. No, I will say it's pretty easy to get around that just by applying to those jobs that say anything from diversity forward, if you're trying to prove my point, to, the Get Human has a whole list of employers that provide human interaction. Like, you can definitely see pretty easily whether, just two suggestions that come to mind offhand there, whether an employer that had access to your actual resume would respond based on race. But this is an additional point. Now, that's a very important additional point. Many employers now have fully automated systems. Do you screen out those employers when you're doing something like this? If not, does that, are black guys more likely to submit the resume a day late? I love my people, but that wouldn't surprise me. Do you adjust for all of this when you do this type of research? I personally think that if you're any good, I try to avoid this. I'm actually quite ethical when it comes to research. It comes to pursuing conclusions. I'm interested in what the truth actually is. Like, if I found racism in a study, I would simply report that. But I think if you're solid as a researcher, you can generally come to either of a number of conclusions based on your political beliefs, I suppose, would be the answer. Again, essentially, yeah, I'm kind of rambling here, but all this would come into play. Like, what I was going to say is, a very simple question when you look at the audit studies that seems to almost never be asked would be how many people of each race got a job? I mean, so when you look at these studies, what they normally consist of is sending the black resume and the white resume to 10 employers and saying there was a 7% lower rate of response to the black resume. But still, if the rate of response was 32% and you applied to 10 jobs, you got 3 jobs. Does it really matter if the white guy got 3.5 jobs? You're only going to work 1, you greedy bastard. So that never comes up. So you could easily write a conservative piece that comes to the conclusion that if you apply for more than 5 open job opportunities, whatever your race, you're going to get a good job. That would be just as valid as the piece showing that there's a 7% margin of discrimination or whatever that might be against African Americans. So this is why I think the ideological breakdown of the academy matters so much. We've already talked about this. I'm not going to go through my routine. It's 95% liberal and so on. It is. But I think that you're going to have 95% of your pool of faculty members out there looking for this racism, rather than 95% of them focusing on how poor kids can get jobs. And I think number 2 is much more important. Like, I think that basic fact of sending in the 10 resumes and you're guaranteed a job appears in very few of these audit studies. I mean, what you just said is an obvious point. Like, if you're black and you're worried about this, apply to large companies that have an automated processing system process. I mean, we both know they do. Apply to black companies. Like, there are dozens of responses. And what I'm interested in is the effectiveness of those responses. Like, a very simple one that just came to my mind now is if your name's Jamari in Washington, just apply for jobs as Jay Washington. Like, nobody has any idea of your race in that case. And I mean, I don't think the boss is going to be a face-to-face racist during the interview, So there's this presented sort of nightmare of American racial conflict. We're at each other's throats, and planes are falling out of the sky and everything else in the media. And then there's the reality of, how'd you get around racism when you applied for a job? It's utterly mundane. I put my first name Jay as opposed to Jamar. I mean, that's what people are actually doing, I'm sure. You can get into questions like, should they have to do that? But I mean, should veterans have had to go to war and get shot at? I mean, life is full of competitive situations and you just sort of adapt and overcome. And applying for a job is not the toughest of those that I can imagine.
And don't they always say too, most jobs aren't most jobs received aren't searched for on the internet a large part of the time. It's through that personal connection, where you go out and you meet the person, you go on LinkedIn, you're like, hey, you're hiring for this position, I'd like to apply, whatever. There's that secondary level of effort that would go into that. I'm curious in terms of the research method, just for a second, just for a bit of an aside. If you are sending out, a bunch of Alian and Shankisla type resumes to places and then no showing on the appointments, are they poisoning the hiring system of the companies that they're applying to?
That's really interesting because, I mean, some of these studies, Bertrand and Melanthon, I think, applied to 6,000 jobs. No, I would have to say no. I mean, there's probably one big audit study per year that sends out maybe 10,000 resumes. So the total number of people applying for jobs must be in the multi-millions every year, blacks and whites. So, I mean, I'm tempted to be like, yep, goddamn hippies screwing up the job market. But no, really, probably not. But it can't help. I mean, that's something actually to think of when you think about this from an ethical IRB perspective.
Yeah.
And definitely these studies shouldn't be prevented. They shouldn't be barred. But whenever you do anything from kind of a heterodox perspective, like when I ask people to value race, there are a lot of hoops that you have to jump through. You could be scaring and intimidating people. And it is worth noting that you could just as easily. And again, it's interesting to see us as just 2 smart guys from the other side of the aisle talking about this. You could, of course, just as easily raise these barriers about this. Like, are you preventing people, at least in one state, at least in one city, it's pretty plausible, from hiring black kids? Because the system is you send out 10,000 resumes, 1 in 3 of them or whatever are accepted, get a call back. And I imagine you probably don't cancel the call back, you just don't show up. The flip of that, though, would be that you're also sending out all these white resumes for kind of hipster-sounding white kids who get hired and don't show up either. So if anything, you're poisoning the well for young people, not for blacks. But it is a worthwhile point.
Some of these things that you go after in your paper are these simultaneously opposite truth things that we have to deal with. There's a large black-white pay gap, etc. These kinds of things, and then it's a multivariate world, and when you start to account for these different variables, these things shrink. So, can you talk a little bit about some of these? Are these untruths? Is that fair? I mean, help us understand what you found out through your study.
Yeah, so this is probably one of the core things that, at least in my popular press books, kind of defines my work, quote unquote. My actual when you talk about the NAS journal, my actual last two academic format papers there dealt with audit studies and hate crimes. So I mean, I also do have kind of a professional body of work that I do as an academic. I mean, I go to the conferences every year and so on. But I mean, in terms of something that I'm known for, that's done at pretty much that same level when I think about like who might cite it or why a publisher would want it, that's a big part of it, like looking at the idea of systemic racism analytically and logically. So what you mentioned is kind of the baseline of the systemic racism argument. What people like Dr. Kendi, Dr. DeAngelo do is look at gaps in society that do exist. I mean, no one denies that there's an arrest rate gap between blacks and whites, and say, well, unless you're a genetic bigot, these gaps have to be due to racism. So no matter how difficult and ugly it is, let's dig out every last vestige of racism and then we'll close the gaps. What a lot of other social scientists say. And there's so much challenge to this in 95% liberal academia that it can get a little discouraging. But, what people on that quantitative, I mean, Thomas Sowell, Amy Chua, June O'Neill, Roland Fryer kind of flank keep saying is, no, if you just adjust for other things that obviously vary between these groups, the gaps go away. And that means they're not due to either racism or genetics. This is one of the most important points in science. So when you look at black people versus white people, the most stunning fact that's on point here, whether you're talking about crime rate or money, is that the average black guy is more than a decade younger than the average white guy. If you look at what's called the modal average, so this is just the most common age. It's not necessarily the best average, but it's the best for illustration here. I mean, the modal average age for a black man is 27, white guy is 58. This is just Pew Research, most common age for different racial groups. For a Hispanic immigrant, I think it was 11. That might be for all Latinos. So when you look at something like crime rate or major league sports participation, income, when it comes to something we don't do well as of yet, it's stupid to compare a 30-year-old guy with a 50-year-old guy. I mean, that's just the most basic, obvious point. It's complete dishonesty not to adjust for this. I mean, and then at the next level, you have region. Like African Americans are far more likely to live in the South where wages are lower for everyone than whites are. It's 50% of us, 15% of Caucasians. And just so on down the line, what are aptitude test scores like? I mean, we play more ball. We're definitely not unfocused on the young ladies in high school, and we're not known as the best students on average. Black SAT is up to 950. That's quite solid, but whites are getting up to 1100, So what's the difference in those test scores? Both groups tease each other about this. We all know it's a reality, and so on down the line. What's family structure like? I mean, if 72% of black children are born into single mom households, what percentage of all our households just have one person in them? 50, 60? So you can't take a household that's in Mississippi with two people, mother and son, hit it up by someone with a solid 1020 SAT. This is going to be a normal taxpayer, driving a Honda, a couple of years old, nothing wrong with her. But you can't take that and compare this to a 5-person Jewish American household in Brooklyn with 2 college degrees in the building. I mean, so that doesn't make any sense. When you adjust for all these other variables, the systemic racism argument completely collapses. The only thing, and a lot of this is just technical semantics. Like what a sociologist on the left would say is, okay, Reilly, you're using the terms a normal person would use or what a political scientist would use. But in terms of systemic racism in left-leaning sociology, what we mean is, this whole system that makes it more difficult to go to college if you live in rural Mississippi. But we already have a word for that, social class. Like when you adjust for class and for the other things that I brought in, I don't see any evidence at all that if you took, this is one final sentence, if you took 2 guys, a black immigrant from Nigeria, Irish immigrant from, you guessed it, and you were able to watch them both attend the University of Minnesota to the bachelor's degree level, get similar scores, and go into the field of engineering. I don't think you would find that in 20 years there was much of any difference whatsoever in the performance of those 2 guys. virtually none. And there are a number of studies that look at this and come to basically this conclusion. So the idea of systemic racism, to a very large extent, centers on taking raw data gaps between people and just attributing them to racism. And what that is really is just a flip side of the alt-right position, where you take these same raw data gaps, what's the crime rate, and you attribute this to genetics. And I think that in quantitative social science, a bunch of us here, at least off the record, are asking, well, how old are these people, quote unquote? Where do they live? And those variables, those dull, mundane things, explain the entire gap.
One of the things, actually, there's so many things I want to ask you about, but one of the things is we all know that Northern Irish descent guy is more likely to become the alcoholic of the two engineers because, in Ireland, if you live there, there's a dramatic divide between the North and the South. And it's not as bad as it used to be, possibly, but, these perceptions exist as well. So again, this gets us back to the ethnicity part, and we can kind of just put a pin in that and talk about that or not. But I'm also curious about, let's just talk about this. So I went out to Chris Thomas King's house. Chris Thomas King's a notable person. He's won 2 Grammys or multiple Grammys on the same night. He played the guitar in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? This guy is, and he's steeped in the blues. His dad had a juke joint out in Louisiana, and he's done a severe rehashing of the history of the blues. And there's a lot of race in this because you've got these educated free Creole people that were allowed manumission, and they were able to evolve socially, economically, into being professional musicians, people that can read and write music. These are not the black people that we hear about in the normal from the 1800s. These are actual cultured people that are part French, part Spanish, have some African ancestry in them. They have this, New Orleans was like the first melting pot. But once the blues started erupting out of New Orleans, the folks from New York, the folks from Chicago started exploiting the artists, how the industry normally does, right? And so I guess on the surface, and maybe legitimately, we're talking about a racial premise where we see these animalistic slave black men. We want authentic, and that's one of the things he talks about is the primitivization of these arts and how the industry attacks artists in general. But the music industry has always taken advantage of the artist, taken the deal, said, hey, we have the marketing skills, you don't. If not for us, you'd still be in some whorehouse in New Orleans having a great time but not making any money. So how do we deal with the racial premise of that? And especially like when you bring in the critical race theory stuff that goes into all of this, you can't extract the racial time out of that and the perception of a New York person. Look, even now to the South, right? They're going to look down on them if I'm going to paint with a broad brush. But what are your thoughts on this, like the stealing of the industry and the racial piece that fits into that?
Well, I actually think that just talking openly without my bias, I mean, this gets into an interesting discussion because we just talked about the idea of systemic racism. And systemic racism, at least in the poorly articulated version that's extraordinarily common in high school and college materials, is the idea that gaps in performance between people are due to racial prejudice. And this simply isn't true. If you take the difference in income between a black household, $44,000, and a white household, $65,000, and you adjust for very simple things like how many people are there in the household, the gap goes away. You might find residual 2 and 3% effects of racism today, but there's also affirmative action today. Like the baseline Kendi claim there is not true. Now, the deeper conversation that you get into, and that he, for that matter, is beginning to touch on, is, well, aren't there a lot more people that are likely to be poor? Like there in many things when it comes to drug use or something like that, there's not really a difference in performance between white and black poor people. But aren't there more people that are likely to be poor as African Americans because of the history of the past, because of conflict in the USA? And the answer is, yeah, of course there are. Just like there are more Appalachian, quote unquote, hillbillies or more natives that are likely to be poor because of the violent history of the country. But I guess where and I think most people in kind of quantitative political science would draw the line is that we don't define being poor today because of a lost race war 100 years ago as systemic racism or as something kind of specific and cringy today. Like at present, you would just be poor. There are many reasons you could be poor. You could be poor because your ancestors came penniless to the USA from Vietnam or Bosnia or something like that. That's not systemic anti-immigrant discrimination. That just means you don't have any money. So like when you look at habits in Black or poor white communities that prevent success today, some of them almost certainly do have an origin point in the past. I don't think anyone would deny that. I don't have a lot of sympathy for people that are just like, screw them. Who cares about these poor, useless people? That's evil. But I mean, if you're looking honestly at this, like if you look at fatherlessness, for example, past racism is really only one of 3 or 4 factors that play into that. So in 1938 or 1945, when the great economist Walter Williams looked at this, the Black illegitimacy rate was, if I remember correctly, 9%. Like the highest I've ever seen it is quoted as being that those years was 12%. Okay. So the difference between that and whatever it was for whites, 5%, probably was due to racism at the time or the history of race in the USA. But it's now 72%. And that's due to other things that have nothing to do with contemporary racism. I mean, that's due to, welfare and its effect on families. That's due to the whole feminist and sexual revolution, which for good or ill revolutionized how we look at our kids and even our bodies. I mean, that's due to, Tom Sowell wrote a book about this, Black rednecks and white liberals, but that's due to kind of shared tough culture, white and Black migrants both brought north. You can't just look at that and say, well, I attribute this to racism. Because there's an immediate follow-up question, like, well, what was the rate immediately after slavery? And what's the rate for Chinese people today? And when you start asking those questions, this simplistic one-bar argument, just like the genetics one, just falls away. So with the blues thing, I mean, if you're asking, is that systemic racism? Well, it was then. Like, that's the thing. Like, I don't think anyone denies that there was actual institutional racism in a real sense of that term that most people would agree on in the USA in 1954 or 46. Like, it was very hard to get a job as a Black, even artist or musician, which is why you had acts like Elvis Presley that went global, international, basically ripping off Black, deep Southern music and popularizing it. But I'm not sure what this means in context today. If someone says, well, the reason Black artists aren't treated well by record companies today is systemic prejudice. No, Black artists, from my experience in the nightlife business, usually today do a better job of negotiating their deals than white artists. One of the things that Black artists feel, and having known a bunch of rappers, interestingly enough, is that the music industry is uniquely dishonest and tough. Not really. Like those kind of first, like I signed a first book contract with a great publisher, I mean, those kind of first deal, like your advance is $2,000, that kind of stuff, that occurs across every business. Like the auto business is a lot more intense than, the music business. So I think today artists are probably pretty much getting screwed equally. You just hear less about it in country songs, but in the past, obviously, the USA had an institutionalized system of racism. One sense, it's stupid not to recognize that the USA had an institutionalized system of racial bias through, say, 54. It's also stupid to not recognize that it's not 1954 today, and in fact that we've had institutional pro-minority affirmative action since 1967. So you can't deny either of those things. Like you can't recognize only the first and pretend that today is still eternally 1938.
One of the things too about this, I think it makes the racism thing a little harder to suss out is the industry was exploding at the time, right? The phonograph was being invented. Up till then, writing music was a way to monetize your music. But if you're a working artist you think about what New Orleans was, especially back then, you got a bunch of dudes hauling bales of cotton or corn or whatever it is down to Mississippi or down to New Orleans so it could be processed. So they get down to the bottom of this 2,000-mile trek and they just want to party. And it just so happens Creole people like a party. And so they, Chris always says that New Orleans invented Saturday night, right? Sunday was a day for rest, but New Orleans, it was a day for party. And so you have this, like, you're working in probably the most culturally diverse, musically powerful place in the nation in New Orleans. So you don't have a whole lot of time to go around and market your stuff. And so some I don't know, we'll just be unfair, New York Jewish guys like, hey, look at all this money that can be made from all these people that don't have any idea. They didn't care what color they are. Like you have this ability to build a crowd together. You can be Puerto Rican, you can be a Mexican, you can be whatever. I just want it. This is money that's sitting on the ground. I'm going to give you some and take some for myself. Phonograph becomes invented. The radio becomes invented. And of course, there's racial lines in that. Like, we don't want you Appalachian hillbillies singing on the radio. Oh, wait, you can draw 10,000 people. Welcome to the radio. Like, you had to prove this. So New York can't invent the art reliably because it's too siloed, it's too established. But out in the Appalachian Hills, bluegrass country and all that, these are things that don't really have a lot to do with race. It has more to do with finances and marketing. I'm not a social scientist, but that's what I would say.
So it's first of all, it's actually not all that difficult to untangle race from class with modern regression methods. I hate it when people say that. It's really as simple as looking at what the average income or whatever is for each social class and for each race, and you've disentangled the two to a large extent. Right. But I mean, without the cliche being used, race and class often at very least influence kind of the same variable or set of outcomes. So many of the unique musicians in the USA that really helped develop the American sound were Black and absolutely were screwed over by record companies. I think that the point a lot of my poor white friends in Appalachia would make is that a lot of, if you look at like Western swing, bluegrass, so on down the line, quote unquote, hillbilly music, the country and country Western, a lot of the artists that developed the American sound were broke Caucasian guys from the woods and the hollers. And they also got screwed over by the record companies, maybe a few percent less or more. But taking these class narratives and making them seem like racial narratives is actually a big problem. This is something that you notice more and more, by the way, where things like Black history in the USA, obviously unique, glorious struggle, so on. But you do notice that a lot of things that were universal in at least the poor man's experience are now being presented as things that happen only to Black people, only in America. Like an example of this would be lynching, where historically, people would literally, quote unquote, get together a posse if there was say a rape in town, because there wasn't an established criminal justice system. So in order to punish the rapist, you would round up a bunch of your boys, you'd get a rope, and you'd go hang the guy from a tree. In the history of the USA, there were something like 6,000 lynchings, and they were majority Black. more than 3,000 of them were of African Americans. Tuskegee keeps this data. But you also had the Western states where most of the people lynched were white or Mexican banditos. This has been redefined as almost exclusively a Black thing. I'm not sure the white and Hispanic and Italian lynchings appear in the lynching museum. They easily could. I could be wrong on this. But that's an example of this, like whipping, which was, and beyond lynching, by the way, hanging was just a punishment for poor men throughout history in the West. Like anyone who couldn't afford the headsman's axe was just walked up on the galleys and they'd kick you in the back and you'd fall for it and be hung. It's really simple. All it takes is a rope and you can reuse the rope. So this is not just a Black thing. Like the founding fathers at the start of the USA said, if we don't hang together, we'll certainly all hang separately. Meaning either we'll win the first round of battles or we'll all be tortured and then hung to death. It's a blunt, honest, funny statement. Same thing with whipping. Whipping was a universal punishment in the British Navy, going down the line among Americans, slaves, indentured servants, probably free people until the past 100 years or so. So we can definitely recognize the uniqueness of the Black experience without saying absurd, stupid things like the record deal you would have signed as an Appalachian guitar picker would be a lot better than the record deal you would sign coming out of New Orleans. That's just obviously not true. So you have the race element, which is where did they decide to go to exploit to some extent, so on. But you also have the class element. And the reality is that a lot of musicians in regions that were never reached into, the great native artists we're now just starting to hear and so on, would have loved to be exploited to the tune of $60,000 a year in the 1940s. It was a tough time.
I wanted to also bring in one aspect to this uncomfortable need to avoid the reality, and that a lot of these things have dual function, or we don't like the uncomfortable truth of what reality is. And you've talked a lot about violence and race, and that's sort of where I'm going with this. But we have this, there's a meme going around right now where it shows a nun in her habit and it shows a young lady in her job. And it basically says, if you're Catholic and you're uncomfortable with this headdress, you're the problem. The problem is that that's a ill-informed meme. First off, if you remove the habit and you remove the hijab, one of them is just an old lady, and the other one is, in a lot of places, is a whore. And in those places, they still stone people. I mean, they put out numbers the other day, 85% of people think it's cool to stone people in Afghanistan. In Jordan, it's north of 50%. I'm talking stoning humans. And so if you walk around without a hijab, you can say that's, they're right or whatever, but it's not. There's an oppressive nature to it. We know that the Islam world is more likely, at least from the numbers I've seen, to attack Christians than Christians attacking Islam. So Islamophobia or Christian, we don't talk about that. We don't talk about the fact that one of the most reviled groups in all of religiondom are the damn Mormons. It's a cult, and they're singled out. And you mentioned them in your study because they are a people that are looked at sideways. And Mormon for Mormon is good people. They try to improve their community. Sure, it's through their lens, but their lens is not filled with, deceit and cunning. It's with family and honor and a pretty good code of ethics. Not saying everybody should become a Mormon, but there's some good there, and yet they're disproportionately represented as being evil. I'm going to shut up now.
Mute this mic. Okay, so the interesting thing there, like when we were talking about race and class, if you're an Appalachian hillbilly, quote unquote, versus a black Creole, you each would face racial bigotry in the other's neighborhood and so on. But in reality, the sweeping, overarching reality of being so poor you probably go hunting for food is going to define a lot more of your experience. So why do we focus on race rather than class? Well, American tradition over the last 60 years. It doesn't make a lot of sense necessarily. But similarly, this was part of the audit studies piece, this idea that we tend to focus on certain kinds of discrimination, like discrimination against, say, black women. But what these audit studies reveal almost in passing, or these polls reveal almost in passing, is that there's a lot more discrimination we never think about against. Just the phrase that comes to mind is almost random ass groups. So in one of these studies, we found that 7% of people wouldn't vote for a Catholic, 8% wouldn't vote for a black person. It was shameful. But then they kept asking questions. It was like 9% wouldn't vote for a woman. 9% for a woman, 9% for a Hispanic, like 19% for a Mormon, 38% for a Muslim. So when you go past is there still some racial and religious bias, you find that there's a massive amount of prejudice of all kinds. Like, people are much less likely to hire ugly people. Even if you view that as at some level justifiable, I don't see how you can justify, 20% society-wide bias against Mormons. So what we choose to look at also determines what the narrative of society is. The reality is that most people probably experience a very similar level of bigotry. Like, the percentage of people that are either female or a member of any minority or Catholic or Jewish or disabled, given the number of veterans we have, so on down the line, that's probably pretty similar to the number of people. So, unless you want to come to the goofy conclusion that there are, 5 or 6 white, male, blonde ex-jocks that secretly run society, you're left dealing with the reality that almost everyone faces these minor issues of bigotry, and people just manage to get through them. Boom, that's pretty much the answer there. And the narrative formation is something that occurs across different areas. Like, what's the story? So, like, right now, the media has decided that the story, when it comes to interracial crime or violence, is white people attacking black people. Like, that's what Black Lives Matter was, right? It was either cops or armed vigilantes like George Zimmerman killing innocent African Americans. And the reality is that that's completely unrealistic as a storyline. Like, violent interracial crime is something like 3% of crime. And when it does occur, it's about 80% black on white. And both those are easily sourceable figures. There are 20 million index crimes a year, violent or serious property crimes. The last year on record that I have, there were about 600,000 violent incidents involving either a black perp and a white victim, or a white perp and a black victim. So 3%, he committed almost all of it. That's the actual story. Like, one, it's not a story. But two, if anyone wanted to focus on 3% of crime, you'd assume it would be the hard right. So instead, you've got this flip where people are isolating these individual horrific cases, George Floyd or Dylan Roof, and they're pretending that there's a national epidemic of this. And it's almost nonsensical. But you realize that in a country of 400 million people, there are going to be enough incidents of anything that are on video, that are in print, that you can make into a storyline. You know, planes falling out of the sky is the example I always use from the late 1990s. If you look at plane crashes, flying is 10 times as safe as driving. But that's not how the media chooses to present it for reasons of profit. And we see that across more sectors than we like to imagine. So much of what we're seeing isn't reality, it's narrative. Think how many times you read the storyline, you know, beautiful child under 18 dies of COVID. How many times has that happened total? 200? It's actually 346, I believe. But the narrative is going to continue. So anytime you say that not every child should be forced to wear, you know, 2-face diapers during a track meet, you know, just having some fun with the masks there. But I mean, the response will be, you want to kill children, because that fits the narrative storyline of every one of these kids has gotten 10 pages of print. So always look for the reality under the story, I think, is a good piece of starting advice on how to be an adult.
I would, I don't want to talk a whole lot more because I've had you for a long time, but one of the other areas I think is problematic is we tend to discover these atrocities. Oh my God. You know, they carved up Mount Rushmore with the 4 presidents' faces. Saw this just the other day. It was a meme that a friend of mine put up, and that used to belong to the Indians, and they called it the 6 grandfathers. Or, oh my God, there was a massacre in this town. So part of my road trip, I went out and talked to some historians about massacres in the Southwest. It turns out, Will, everybody killed everybody out there. The army killed people, Mexicans killed people, different kinds of Apaches killed different kinds of people. I mean, to include other Apaches. Humans, the human animal is a pretty violent thing until only fairly recently. And so we have these narratives that aren't attached to reality. We had Sarah Brosh on the show. This is a great example. Yeah. I don't know who's right in that situation, right? I wasn't there. I haven't read all the stuff, but I know that when I hear her side of the story, I hear like, hey, there's a problem here in terms of the institution's role in taking responsibility and protecting someone from a protected class. And then you had another protected class come in, and it's all of a sudden she's reviled and evil. And there are people that are irrationally angry about this without having any real distinct knowledge of these things. So I guess what I'm saying is our combined ignorance about history doesn't mean that the nation is or has always been racist. It just means that we haven't bothered to learn history. And then if you wash it all through a racial filter, I would submit that you're not going to be able to contextualize history properly, because there's just too many things you can't explain. How in the world did this Chinese guy go down to Benson, Arizona and build a store that existed for 100 years? This is a Chinese guy in southeastern Arizona, you know, with people like Wyatt Earp walking around. I mean, that doesn't seem like that's possible in a country that's filled with racism. But because we're too precious with our historical knowledge and we don't want to go out and do the work, we end up with these false things that are tied to emotion rather than to reason, I think, at least.
Yeah, no, in terms of that individual example, I mean, that guy could have just been a martial arts expert who used to soldier for the emperor. I mean, he could be an exceptional case. But, like, this is actually a very big problem in the USA. And this gets into one of the core themes of, I guess, my research and writing, along with breaking down systemic claims, which is how narratives are created. If you look at a lot of the storylines in modern society today, like the Black Lives Matter narrative of anti-minority genocide, which is what attorney Benjamin Crump literally titled a major recent book, or the interracial crime narrative, you know, Barbecue Becky, Pool Patrol Paula, so on to Coupon Carl. Blacks and whites are constantly at one another's throats, with whites committing, say, 60% of the offenses. The systemic racism narrative, sure. But just on and on down the line, the COVID youth narrative, the terrible history narrative, a lot of these storylines that are presented don't bear much resemblance to the truth. And it's worth remembering that you can always take exceptional cases or certain sets of facts out of context and make that seem to be the pattern that mattered during X period of time. Like a classic example of this that's just kind of funny and casual, but everyone in the 1960s hated hippies. I mean, they were seen as these sort of dirty bastards who insisted on hooking up in public despite their 1960s standards of genital hygiene, you know, throwing bags full of crap at the police. You know, at best, they were seen as sort of revolutionary wannabe warriors. At worst, they were seen as kind of filthy. There's a mass of polling data that indicates this is the truth. Most people knew and liked someone who fought in Vietnam, a major war where we lost 60,000 good citizens. So, I mean, But since the 1960s, we've seen a considerable redefinition of the hippie movement. People are making movies about Woodstock and the Panthers and the Weathermen with these beautiful actor types playing people that are in fact scruffy 120-pound radicals with syphilis, and so the narrative has become, during the 1960s, that was the hippie movement, that was the summer of love and the summer of rage, and the storyline has moved away from like, we don't smoke marijuana in Muskogee, which is a lame song, but actually was #1 in the late 1960s. It's moved away from the large majority of Americans that thought all this was stupid and were helping their brothers and cousins get ready to fight the communists. So the creation of these storylines is something that we need to be aware of, and that when it's negative, we need to openly oppose, as I think it was in the case of the 1960s storyline. The idea that these communist spies were some kind of hero. But what you're describing now is this sort of partial, and you're right, by the way, when you mentioned we've talked for a while, I'm gonna have to jump off in a couple minutes. But I mean, these partial storylines about history, like if you just take all of the white atrocities that occurred during the Indian Wars, you have a story of white atrocity, but you're omitting all the native atrocities that took place during the Indian Wars. I mean, we didn't have the Geneva Convention until 1954. So, I mean, if you lost a battle, people would scalp you or cut your dick off. I mean, they'd burn the bodies. Both the whites and the natives were above the level of cannibalism, but people in other regions of the world certainly weren't. And that was pretty ethnically diverse in terms of, who engaged in that practice. So realistically, the actual context for history is that women couldn't vote here, I believe, anywhere else in the world until 1920. We didn't have rules of war until 1950. All of history was extraordinarily savage. I mean, when you describe the Wild West, like, you broke down the major players there, but you had the Plains Indians, you had the Mexicans, you had the Texans, who weren't Americans, and in a lot of cases weren't sure whether to think of themselves as Anglo or Hispano at that time. I mean, you had the whites moving west. You had, up until the 15 or 1600s, I mean, you had what was left of the Mexica. I mean, basically Aztecs that were fighting in the southern part of this region, the Comanche, the Pueblo, the great tribes. I mean, so there was even a distinction between the Plains Indians and kind of the southern desert Indians, like the Apache. And all of these people had basically full-scale field armies that were fighting one another brutally, that were killing one another terribly. So it's absolutely acceptable to say in the USA, we moved on to become a more mature state. We want to pay some version of reparations for this. We feel bad about our destruction of native property, so on. But it's absolutely nonsensical to pretend that violence is some sort of white characteristic, and that the native warriors and the black buffalo soldiers and the Mexican posse guys and so on did not engage in this. So very often, and especially from the political left, I think you see this type of fantasy being presented as honest history. So people that are fantasy will say, what we want is to discuss racism. And the reality is that most normal tax-paying citizens want to discuss racism and violence. We just don't want to pretend that that's confined to one group of people in one period in time, because that's nonsensical.
Wilfred, I appreciate you coming on.
Wilfred, I appreciate you coming on the show. Let me shut this thing down.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly.